Hello and welcome to this tutorial on how to edit your camera settings in Crayta. So the camera in Crayta is really customizable. You can change the camera angle and this can have a huge impact on the way that your game feels. There are some conventions that already exist to do with different camera angles and the types of games that they are linked to. So we're going to talk about how to get hold of those different camera angles and change the settings to those in this tutorial. And that can then lead you down the path to create something like a real-time strategy game, or maybe a top-down RPG, or maybe a side-scrolling platformer. So the camera angle can dramatically change how you start to build your game, as well as the way your players play it. Now we're going to be experimenting with camera settings in this game, which is a horror game. So the horror genre is quite fun to play around with camera stuff, because you can hide things from the players in using the camera in a really fun way. Games like Silent Hill did this really well. You can force players to look at certain things and make them see the horrors in your game, and you can also force them to imagine what those horrors are by hiding those things. So what you see in front of the camera is just as important as what's hidden behind the camera. Don't forget that. And if you're at all interested in this stuff, then I strongly recommend you go and check out some cinematography stuff on YouTube. There's some really cool stuff out there about different camera angles and what they mean and the emotional impact they will have on the viewer. And it's all like subliminal stuff as well. So definitely worth looking into if you're interested in game design and cameras like me. So in order to change our camera settings, I'm going to head over to the editor. So I'm currently playing the game. So I need to go into the advanced editor because I'm going to need to edit the player template. Now the player template has the camera stuff all attached to it. So to get to that, over here on this drop down which says world, I'm going to click on that and I'm going to click on player. So here I'm in my player template, and the main focus for this is going to be on this entity editor over here. And if I scroll down here, I get to the point where it says camera type, and that is the beginning of the camera settings. So all of this stuff in here is to do with the players like jumping and their control layout and all that sort of stuff. Add camera type, from here down it's to do with the camera. So the default camera type is this action camera, which is kind of an over the shoulder look. So this is like the sort of camera angle that you get on things like The Last of Us, Gears of War, and things like this, and things like Fortnite as well. So you'll see this camera angle quite a lot. It's quite interesting because you can see the character and it puts them in their environment. So it gives you an idea of scale of everything. And it also lets you see things happen to this thing in front of you. So the emotional attachment to that is kind of like you're watching this thing that you like being hurt, whereas in a first-person shooter, you're the actual thing that's getting shot at. So that brings you even closer to the action. Here, we're just one step removed from the action, which means that we can think about things just a little bit more freely and a little bit clearer than when we're right in the action. So back to the player. So that's the action camera. Now, the other type of camera we've got access to is the orbit camera. And the orbit camera is really cool. What that does is it detaches the camera from the player. So now my camera can move around my player, and notice that with the action camera, my player turned with the camera. Whereas with the orbit camera, I can move all the way around and my player is still facing that point on the wall over there for some reason. I can still move my character using WASD. But also something to bear in mind is that the movement is relative to the way the camera is facing. So at the moment, my camera's facing this way, so W will go this way, or forwards goes this way, and backwards goes this way. Whereas if I point my camera at those stairs over there, forward will take them there. Now for regular game players, this is quite a common thing, and you will have no time in getting to grips with it. But for game players who maybe don't use this kind of camera very often or don't play this kind of game very often, it can be a little bit fiddly, so it's something to be a bit aware of. So that's the orbit camera. Now going back to my player, the settings below the camera type will change depending on which camera type you have selected. So I'm going to turn it back to action. We'll go through the settings for the action camera. And then once we've done that, I'll change it to orbit and we'll go through the settings for the orbit camera. So the first setting is camera collision enabled. And this is really easy to see this in action. So at the moment, it's enabled by default. Didn't update. Let me just do that again. It's enabled by default, which means that when my camera collides with something, such as this voxel wall over here, notice that the camera is colliding with the wall and pushing into the player. So it's getting really, really close because it can't maintain that distance from the player. Now, if I turn that camera collision off, so going back to the player, let's turn the camera collision off. You'll see that if I do the same thing, go over to this wall, the camera no longer collides with the wall. Instead, it just clips straight through it. And this can give like sometimes a bit of a visual glitch effect, but it can also be used in order to show the player things like I can now see through this wall. Something to bear in mind with turning off camera collisions is if you've got a really thin wall, let's just thin this down a bit. Okay. If you've got a really thin wall, then it can actually cause it to obscure the camera. Now, that might be good if you're if you want to use that for some kind of creative flair, but it can also be really, really annoying for your players. So just be a bit aware that camera collision enabled is often turned on by default just because it helps your players. Now, if your game is outside and doesn't have any walls, then you could turn that off and that would also work really well. The forced camera perspective allows you to choose between first person or third person or no restrictions and allow players to choose themselves. So at the moment it's set to no restrictions, and by default mine is set to third person camera mode. Now if I wanted to, I could force players into the first person camera mode, which means that now they are the character. So notice that they don't have a body. They are almost like a floating camera. They are the thing in the action. So this is the kind of camera angle that you're going to need for a first-person shooter. Shocking, because it's first-person, right? Or it could be, you know, I've played a horror game that's very, very similar to this in first-person. And that can be quite cool because it forces you to be in that environment. There's nothing between you and what's happening, so it makes you feel enclosed in that environment and things are happening to you. So you can feel a little bit more emotive in that way. So that was the forced camera perspective. So third person only forces the camera into this third person perspective, and then no restrictions, as I said, allows the players to choose themselves. Can iron sight? So iron sight is essentially when you aim down the barrel of a gun, for example, or just zoom in. So if I turn that on, it means that my secondary fire now allows me to zoom in. So I can use this if I'm on a bit of an exploring game and I can be like, oh, what's over there? And I can zoom in slightly. So that's quite good, but it also allows you to aim down sight. So in some games, some shooting games, that's really useful because it allows you to be more accurate. However, in some games like Counter-Strike, for example, that specifically is a no-no because it forces players to master the run and gun. So that was can iron sight, and notice when I check that box, I get a bunch more settings. So we'll go through these first, and then I'll turn it on, and we'll go through them. So actually, let's just turn them on. So these settings, these 4 settings here, are all to do with the field of view, FOV, which is how wide or how narrow the player's vision is. Now, third person FOV and first person FOV by default are 90 degrees, which allows them to see a 90-degree angle. If I increase that to, let's say, 160, you'll see that now I can see a much wider angle, but the things in front of me look much, much further away. So you can use this as quite a dramatic, almost like Stanley Kubrick, The Shining kind of corridor vibe, where things feel really, really far away that are in front of you and really, really close in that are next to you. But it's a bit distorted, and it can actually be quite difficult to play a game like that. So 90 is a really good standard. So if you're not fussed about the FOV or the field of view, just leave it at 90. Now, the iron sight has a different FOV, because the lower this number is, the more zoomed in it is. So I've got iron sight checked, and at the moment it goes down to 60. The FOV changes from 90 to 60, which gives us that zoomed in approach. If I wanted to zoom in more, I could reduce that all the way down to 30. And now when I iron sight, you'll notice it's much, much closer. So you can use this to change how far, maybe you want to make a sniping game. And that FOV you can then change to be quite a low number. And that will then make your sniper rifles a lot more zoomed in. One thing that goes along with that is this iron sight look speed multiplier. So at the moment, this means that my mouse or right analog stick or whatever I use to look in the game will move at half the amount of speed that it does normally. And that's because if it was to move at the same speed, it would be really, really too quick and be very, very difficult to be accurate. So now with that set to 1, the look speed is very, very difficult to control, and it's a lot harder to be accurate. However, it means I can very quickly still look around. If I reduce that number, let's go back in there and let's drop it down to 0.1. My look speed on my iron sight is now much, much slower, so I can be a lot more accurate, but I can't snap the camera around very easily. So you can use it for a couple of different reasons, and essentially it works well with the different types of guns that you might have, depending on what kind of weapons you want in your game world. So, returning back to the player, let's just set these back to the original properties. And now let's turn this camera type to orbit. And so notice now that we have a different set of settings that we can change here. So the camera distance is how far away from the player the camera is. So at the moment it's set to 500. If I wanted to, I could make this much, much further away. So I set it to 1000. And notice now my camera is much, much further away. And this is quite a nice technique for making your character seem quite small and actually quite vulnerable. So that's the camera distance. Now, before I change the camera pitch and camera yaw, I'm going to set this camera angle lock checkbox, which means that now my orbit camera is stuck in whatever angle I decide to set here with the camera pitch and camera yaw. If I had this unchecked, I would still be able to move it around with the mouse. So now, whatever way I move my mouse, the camera is staying where it is. So notice we can, this has like quite a dramatic difference in the way the game feels to play. Almost feels like there's someone else there holding the camera. And it can be quite annoying to play it without tweaking these settings. So if you wanted to do a fixed camera angle, then I strongly recommend that you set the camera angle quite early on in your game's development, so that you don't accidentally put walls and objects and things in the way of the camera and in the way of the player. So I've set this camera angle, and at the moment it's set on the ground level or on player level at 90 degrees. So if I wanted to set this directly above the player, I would set that to minus 90 or minus 89. Now when I play the game, you'll see that I'm on this top-down kind of camera angle. And this is really fun. This is like Hotline Miami or original Grand Theft Auto kind of camera angle. And you could do this in a combat game just as much as you could do this in like a top-down RPG kind of game, as it gives like a unique perspective on your game world. Just be a bit aware that anything on the walls is going to be very difficult to see. So, for example, there's a coat of arms on this wall over here, and I can see it top down, but it's a bit more difficult to see it. This kind of camera angle is also really cool for showing things that might be attached to the ceiling. So like there's a skeleton, for example, in there. So I get a close-up of that, and it adds this really nice parallaxing effect. So it can be really fun to play with this kind of camera angle. And then you can set it to somewhere in between. Set it to -50. So this gives it like a different kind of third-person camera view, and this can be more like Baldur's Gate or Silent Hill kind of. You're slightly removed from the action, and you're forced to look in a certain direction, but you can still kind of hack and slash. It's like a hack and slash kind of camera angle. Now, going back to setting the camera at 0 camera pitch. If I now change this camera yaw to 0, the yaw changes whereabouts the camera is facing. So now my camera is facing at my player on, with 0 yaw, and this camera angle works quite nicely as almost like a platformer. So I could make a 2D platformer like this. Now the camera collision is misbehaving a little bit there because I haven't built my game world specifically for that. So if I turned off camera collision, you can see it's starting to feel a little bit more like a platformer. Or like one of those 2.5D kind of games like Limbo or Little Nightmares, those sorts of games where it's like that 2.5D. You can still move forwards and backwards, but or on the Z-axis, but the dynamic is very much on a side-scrolling effect. Now, one thing to bear in mind with having a fixed camera angle, fixed distance, and camera collision turned off is that sometimes it can be really difficult to see what your player is doing. So I really recommend that you set that camera angle early and you make sure that your game is made in a way where it's going to be visible to see what your player is up to. So notice up here, when I go to this top floor, it can be a bit difficult to see what my player is doing when they're jumping. So, for example, in my game, if I was going to do that, what I would do is, if I was going to use that camera angle, what I would do is I would probably just remove all of the ceilings from my game. Let's just take that away. And now, when I go up here, I can see like the side of the wall, but that's okay. It's not obfuscating my vision, and actually it'd be quite a nice thing to do to sort of add battlements or something like that, or some nice details to the top here, but nothing that gives the game away. So one last thing I want to talk about in the orbit camera mode is this secondary action aim camera option. Now at the moment it's set to do nothing, which means when I use my secondary fire button, or I'm on mouse, so mine's right click, it doesn't do anything. But if I set this to snap camera to character, I can actually use this to leverage the action camera in my game as well. So at the moment I'm fixed to this camera angle, but now if I right click, you'll see that I get the camera angle of my character. And actually with holding right click, I can move the camera around. So again, this might need a bit of tweaking, especially when it comes to walls and fixed camera distances and stuff like that. But this could be a really fun way to rethink a genre where you can run around like this, and then when the action happens or something goes down, you can right click in and you can still have your sword fight this way if you want to. Another thing you can do is you can set the snap character to camera. And this might need a little bit of specific scripting, because what this is going to do is whichever way my camera is facing, it will force my character to face that way. So this might be something that's a little bit more useful when you don't have the camera angle locked. So here I am with an unlocked camera, and maybe I notice something behind them, and I can right click and they'll face immediately behind them. So that's a handy couple of additional things you can do in the orbit camera that make sure that it's still quite accessible to use even though the character is facing a different way from the camera. Cool. And that's it. That's the tutorial on cameras. Hopefully that was helpful. I tried to slip in some cinematography bits in there as well, because we were talking about cameras, and hopefully they were useful to you. I've shown you a few different game styles that you can attach to different cameras, and so it would be worth investigating what they feel like in some of your games, and also experiment, get in the camera settings and have a little play and see what new camera angles you can come up with. Maybe it's an underwater game shot from the bottom, maybe it's a space game shot from the side, who knows. Anyway, I hope you enjoy playing with the camera settings and changing your game and playing a different game in Crayta. I look forward to seeing you in there.